and our fourth speaker is Professor Andrew Griffiths. Andrew is the Professor of Strategy and Business Sustainability in the Business School at the University of Queensland. He's also the Director of the Sustainable Business Unit and currently the group leader of our strategy cluster. His main interests are in corporate sustainability, change, institutional governance systems and disruptive change. Andrew.
Thanks, Tim. I suppose I'd like to start by saying I feel partly like a fraud being here because I'm not a water specialist, but I do a lot of work around the impact of extreme events. And what we've seen over the last 5 or 6 months here in the southeast and more broadly throughout Queensland has been a series of fairly significant extreme weather events, which has direct implications for our infrastructure and our communities, and specific implications for our water infrastructure. Now, I agree with both with Paul and Pat that in actual fact we're really measuring the extremes of normal cycles. But what we can expect to see is increasing severity of some of those extremes as we have exacerbating effects associated with climate change. I suppose from that, I think that there's really 3 key implications for us as a community and 3 implications for water. And the first one is around resilience. How do we create infrastructure and communities that are resilient? Now, it's quite topical at the moment. It's going to be very topical all the way throughout the inquiry which is underway. And the notion is, well, let's just build levees, or let's just build more infrastructure, or let's relocate. There are, in actual fact, really only a range of limited responses to creating long-term resilience to those types of flood extremes. The second key issue, I think, is around redundancy. Should we not be thinking of, instead of building long-term sustainable infrastructure, should we be possibly proposing that we build redundant infrastructure? Infrastructure that has shorter lifetime, shorter lifespan, and that requires a different thinking of the types of distribution models that we're talking about and the types of location decisions of where such infrastructure is in a community. And I think the third key point is around behaviour change. We've seen a lot of behavioural change associated with climate proofing or drought proofing our communities in relation to water and water usage. There's been a lot of musings about why we can't have similar standards of behavioural change around our energy consumption, and we might be able to achieve that. But I think the lessons that we can broadly take are that when people are fed information, they're given targets, and it has a measurable or meaningful consequence, we can actually initiate behavioural change. And I think that's why we most probably haven't seen a bounce back in terms of the water usage rates in the southeast corner over the last 12 months. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you indeed to all 4 gentlemen for those introductory comments. Now, when we set this session up, we did ask people if they wanted to email in questions beforehand, and I might utilise one of those questions to kickstart the discussion off, and this comes from Peter O'Neill. Gentlemen, as we know, there's been a lot of discussion, there will continue to be discussion over the coming days and indeed the coming weeks about the capacity of Wivenhoe. And for those of you, including myself, who are not intimately involved, these percentages seem to have varied considerably over time as to what is the appropriate percentage for Wivenhoe, the Wivenhoe catchment there. But the issue from Peter is essentially around not so much the percentage, but should the maximum water storage in Wivenhoe be based on the long-term weather forecasts for the Brisbane River catchment for the coming 6 to 12 months, as opposed to a shorter-term management process? I might turn to Paul first in relation to that.
The issue here is Wivenhoe was always designed to handle 2 risks. the risk associated with supply and the risk associated with oversupply, that is floods. The 100% was a number that was agreed would be the supply maximum, and then there was an additional approximately 100% above that for flood mitigation. What has happened in Queensland is that there's been investment in alternative sources of drinking water, of potable water, desalination, potentially reuse, potable reuse. The reason I think this question can now be addressed and may well take you in the direction of 75% or some number lower than 100 is that the risks at the bottom end have been reduced somewhat because you've added additional capacity. So it's not as dependent on Wivenhoe. But it's a technical question that needs to be addressed under a number of scenarios. That's the first thing. That I think there is a change in the risk profile at the drought end which suggests you may have more capacity to reduce the storage. But I can't give you a number on what that should be. The second point I'd make is that there is only one way to forecast climate, and that is backwards. Everyone is really good at predicting. If I want to predict climate in the next year, each day I'm going to ask you, I'm going to take you on for a bottle of red that you predict the weather in the next day for the next year. I know how I'll win. I just use today's weather. If I use today's weather, I will beat any other model that you have of predicting weather for the next year. But I'll miss certain key events, without a doubt. So I think this ability to predict weather over a long period of time and where the rain will fall has an errors associated with it that are really very large. And think back to the drought. Think back to that drought period. We had storms. We had storms during the drought period. We had some occasions where the Logan River was in large flood. But it didn't rain in the Wivenhoe catchment. Because the Wivenhoe catchment for a lot of part of our cycle is not a particularly well-located area to get lots of rain. Would you believe that? If you'd moved to Brisbane 18 months ago, you'd say that's rubbish. In other words, there's a variability in weather prediction that I'm not confident about you can use in anything except a very conservative way. But I do think our risk profile of supply and oversupply has changed, and I think that should be factored into a reassessment.
John, can I turn to you and ask whether or not there are any lessons from the Murray-Darling in relation to the usefulness or otherwise of weather forecasts?
Well, I think there's different situations. Certainly we haven't, we've done a lot of work trying to find usefulness of essentially prediction of the El Nino cycle. Typically the answer is because farmers are working on an annual cycle that at this stage the information comes too late to be of very much use. So if the forecasts were available a few months earlier, it would be valuable. As it is, it isn't. But I will make a couple of points following on from Paul. The first is, well, there's one thing that is pretty safely predictable in our climate, and that's that we're going to get more rain in January than in June. And that in itself says we shouldn't have a fixed 100% target. We should aim to go into the wet season with reserve capacity to deal with floods and come out of the wet season with a higher level of water to deal with the fact that it's going to be dry for the next 6 or 8 months. Where the risk that Brisbane will suffer major flooding in June, I think I can confidently say remains very small. So the idea of setting a single number and adhering to that number year round, that's a bad idea even if we knew nothing about what the current year was going to be compared to the following year. Whether we can make use of El Nino forecasts, we certainly are in a better position to do that, I think, in Brisbane than we are in the context of the Murray-Darling.